This is the Stephen Mansfield Podcast.
Well, welcome to the Stephen Mansfield Podcast. Great to have you with me here, where we consider our times through the lens of faith and leadership, character, and history. Say, before I dive in for today, let me say this to you, that we are looking for sponsors for the Stephen Mansfield Podcast. This is a podcast that's heard all over the world. It largely reaches leaders. And if you'd like to reach that crowd with your advertising and support what we do here at the Stephen Mansfield Podcast, contact us. The easiest way for you to do that is to contact me through my website, stephenmansfield.tv, and we will chat. All right, let's dive in. One of the things that I have been urging you to think about, that's not, by the way, easy to do, is the fact that many of the institutions that we have relied on, that we have counted on, that we have grown up with in our times are going away or being drastically rewritten, drastically remodeled, drastically changed. I've told you already that there are entire nations in the world that are likely to go away or be completely remade in the next years. We've talked about England. We've talked about European countries. We've talked about Asia. This is very likely to occur. Well, there's another one that I want you to start watching and paying attention to, and that is Hollywood. Now, many of us have paid attention to Hollywood of late because we're aware of the fires, and the fires have burned a lot of stars' homes and threatened a lot of big events, and also threatened, of course, some of the studios and their properties and their warehouses. We won't know yet exactly what the damage is, but there's no question that the fires had a profound effect upon Hollywood. But I'm saying that even before the fires, Hollywood was in freefall. I'm not saying that morally, although as a Christian, I certainly have my problems with Hollywood. But let's just get sentimental for a moment. You know, I grew up with Hollywood. In fact, growing up in Europe as an American military dependent, movies were my main connection with the United States. I loved what Hollywood produced. I loved the movies. It was movies that spoke to me of who we were as a people and that entertained and that elevated. And, you know, I'm a historian. Some of my earliest exposure to history were films about Churchill or films about our military past. In other words, I liked Hollywood. I enjoyed what it produced for the most part. Now, it got weird later in my life, got perverse, but nevertheless, I was grateful for Hollywood. It was one of the great American institutions, and it impacted the world. But I want to say to you that it's very, very possible, and I'm going to give some evidence for this, but it's very, very possible that Hollywood, as we've known it, as the force that it has been, is going away, and fairly soon. The fact is that the film industry is abandoning Hollywood, and huge production facilities are being built elsewhere than California. Money, interest, focus is moving away from Hollywood, and that we may see Hollywood abandoned, essentially, by the film industry in our lifetime. For example, there's a mad rush to build a huge new studio in Las Vegas. You can look all of this up online. Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, New Jersey, and other states are aggressively competing for projects. Now, this is happening. It's a standard thing. I live in Washington, D.C. There's a huge organization as part of the city government that tries to draw films. That's why so many. Have you noticed how many television shows and how many films are filmed there in Washington, D.C.? It's because the city's going after it. Well, now other cities and huge states with huge budgets are trying to draw projects. And there's a lot of good reason not to be in California, not to be in Hollywood. It just goes on and on. Just a few weeks ago, Apple TV agreed to film more projects in France. They've signed deals to film in France. It's unbelievable. Netflix recently bragged that it has 40 projects underway in Europe and is even more committed to Southeast Asia. Now, these are some of the great big entities in modern filmmaking. So on the one hand, people can say, well, this is good. We're being diverse. We're going global. We're working more internationally. And I understand the positives of that. But Hollywood as an institution, it's likely that your young children will not speak of Hollywood as the primary filmmaking location in America. And this is causing tremendous frustration. Tremendous frustration. One of the primary filmmakers of the last decades has been Quentin Tarantino. And he now says he'd rather write a stage play. And in fact, he's doing just that. Let me quote, being careful not to use his language, something that he says. Here's Quentin Tarantino. Making movies? What the blank is a movie now? Something that plays in theaters for a token release for 4 blanking weeks, and by the second week, you can watch it on television. I didn't get into all this for diminishing returns. It was bad enough in 2019, and that was the last blanking year of movies. And that was a blank deal as far as I was concerned. It's gotten drastically worse, and that it's just a show pony exercise now. In stage theater, you can't do that. In theater, people pay a lot of money to get into their seat, but there's no blanking taping, no blanking cell phones. You own the audience. So now, this end of quote, by the way. So now many people, including a major filmmaker like Quentin Tarantino, are finding that it's better to write plays. I'm sure Hamilton has inspired anybody who has ever aspired to write a play. We really are seeing a dramatic decline. Consider what an Oscar winner named Peter Rotter has said in a public letter about the crisis in Hollywood music business. This is just music. He says, the musicians are not able to make ends meet as the amount of scoring here in LA has fallen off the cliff. I see the infrastructure of the LA recording industry about to fail. It's only a matter of time until this happens. Our town has become silent, still, and devoid of music making. Now, I do not want to sit here on the air and claim that I have a lot of famous stars as my friends. I do not. But I have a few movie actor friends. You would know who they are, but I'm not going to mention them on the air. And so I've called them to say, hey, I don't know anything about Hollywood. I mean, I go to the movies like everybody else, but I don't pay attention to that industry. Is what I'm hearing true? And the 2 or 3 that I have, people you would know whom I can call and say, fill me in, they've said absolutely, without question, the movie industry in Hollywood is, as this quote just said, falling off a cliff. The town is silent. It's almost impossible to get hired. Money is not there. Activity is not happening. All the supporting industries are just dropping like a stone. And so this is one of the arts of paying attention to what's happening in our society. A lot of this podcast is about helping you understand your times. And sometimes the forces are philosophical, and sometimes the forces are religious, and sometimes the forces are economic. But the reality is that Hollywood is going away in the same way that I think certain nations will go away, in the same way certain industries are going away, in the same way that the Trump administration is very likely to completely rewrite government in the next 4 years. Things you've grown up with, things you're used to, references that you make regularly, they won't be relevant anymore. And I think you should keep your eye on the ball. I think it's very, very possible that in the next few years, we are going to see Hollywood not become a ghost town, but become a bit of a museum. Because the reality is that filmmaking has moved into these private companies outside of Hollywood, Netflix, Apple, etc. They're making films internationally. Other nations have become more attractive. Other states have become more attractive. And let me just say something quickly about California. I know it's standard for Christians and conservatives to pick on California. I lived in California for a year when I was growing up. My father was at the Defense Language Institute at Fort Ord, California. I was only 12, and so it's not like I mastered knowledge of the state, but I did have a certain love of it. My mother was born there, grew up there, and loved it, and took us around to Big Sur and Carmel and all the beautiful places. And so I have a love of California, and I'm not just hammering it because somehow I'm angry about it or a conservative who dislikes its socialist, almost socialist government. But I will tell you that a lot of the fleeing of Hollywood has to do with the condition of California. Crime is high. People are hurting. Taxes are ridiculous. The government, whether you want to use the word, the initials DEI or woke or socialist, the state government is absurd. And I have many friends out there of every religious stripe and every political stripe, and they are all decrying what California is. I think I've told you on this podcast in recent years that I've done events, for example, in Arizona, and met dozens and dozens of people who had fled Oregon and fled California. I mean, there's literally a kind of an upscale refugee movement out of these states into Texas, into Arizona, into New Mexico. And that's a lot of what had already been happening with Hollywood. So we're living at a time when we're not just going through a lot of change technologically, et cetera, maybe morally, religiously, philosophically in our country, but we are seeing absolute destruction, decline, removal of institutions, and it's going to affect who we are. It's going to affect the forces that shape our lives. Keep your eye on the ball. Watch what's happening, because that Hollywood would become, if not a ghost town, but a museum, will change the world in which you're living.
Stephen Mansfield is a New York Times best-selling author, a popular speaker, and a frequent faith and culture commentator in international media. His groundbreaking books on faith and society include The Faith of George W. Bush, The Search for God in Guinness, Mansfield's Book of Manly Men, and Lincoln's Battle with God. Learn more at stephenmansfield.tv.